My name is Sophia Martinez. I'm 31 years old, and I never thought I'd see my parents standing on my doorstep at midnight with suitcases, demanding I open my door like they own the place. But there they were, my mother Dolores clutching her purse with white knuckles, my father Frank holding a duffel bag, both of them looking at me like I was the villain in some twisted family drama. The worst part? They actually had keys to my house. Keys I'd given them for emergencies, not for hostile takeovers. As I stood there in my pajamas, staring at these two people who raised me, I realized this wasn't a visit or a request for help. This was an invasion, and somehow, I was about to discover that my golden child brother Derek had just walked away with $740,000 while my parents expected me to clean up the mess. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one because what happened next completely changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The full scope of what had happened didn't hit me until my parents had dumped their belongings in my living room and started explaining their situation like they were discussing the weather. I'd always known my family had issues, but I thought I understood the dynamics. I was wrong about everything. Growing up, I was the responsible one who worked 3 jobs through college while Derek, my older brother by 4 years, was the charming one who could talk his way out of any consequence. My parents funded every single one of his failed ventures, from the food truck that never served a meal to the online marketing company that existed only on paper. Meanwhile, I put myself through architecture school, graduated with honors, and built a successful practice in Portland designing sustainable housing projects. For months leading up to this nightmare, my parents had been secretive about their finances. When I called to check in, they'd change the subject or give vague answers about handling some business matters. I should have pressed harder, but I trusted them to make adult decisions about their own lives. What I didn't know was that Derek had been working on them for over a year, filling their heads with stories about a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity. He claimed he'd found a way to flip commercial properties that would triple their investment within 18 months. The presentation he gave them was professional, complete with fake testimonials and doctored financial projections. My parents, who'd always believed Derek was destined for greatness despite decades of evidence to the contrary, saw this as his moment to finally succeed. When I warned them about Derek's history during a family barbecue last summer, they dismissed my concerns as jealousy. "You've always resented your brother's creativity," my mother told me while my father nodded in agreement. "Just because you chose the safe path doesn't mean Derek should limit his potential." I tried explaining that creativity and fiscal responsibility weren't mutually exclusive, but they'd already made up their minds. Derek was going to make them wealthy, and I was the pessimistic sister who couldn't see his vision. That conversation ended with my mother accusing me of trying to sabotage Derek's dreams and my father suggesting I focus on my own business instead of criticizing family members. The truth, as my parents explained it that night in my living room, was devastating in its stupidity. They hadn't just invested their savings with Derek. They had sold their 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, the house where I grew up, the house my father had spent 20 years renovating with his own hands, and given every single penny to my brother. $740,000, representing 30 years of mortgage payments and home improvements, handed over to Derek with a handshake and a promise. They didn't consult lawyers, didn't set up contracts, didn't even keep copies of the fake business plan Derek had shown them. They simply signed the house over to Derek's business entity, trusted him to handle the sale, and waited for their returns. Derek had promised to buy them a luxury retirement condo in Florida once the investments paid off. For 6 weeks, he sent them updates about property acquisitions and renovation progress. The updates were elaborate, including photos of buildings he claimed to be purchasing and detailed financial projections showing their returns growing daily. My parents were so excited they started planning their retirement lifestyle, browsing vacation packages, and talking about visiting grandchildren they didn't have yet. Then Derek stopped answering their calls. The business phone number went to voicemail. The office address turned out to be a mail forwarding service. When my parents finally tracked him down at his apartment, they found it cleaned out except for a note saying he was sorry things didn't work out as planned. The investigation my father conducted with help from their bank revealed the horrifying truth. Derek hadn't invested a penny of their money in real estate. Instead, he'd used $600,000 to pay off gambling debts that had accumulated over 5 years of casino visits and online poker games. The remaining $140,000 had gone toward his cocaine habit and a 3-week vacation in Las Vegas, where he'd lost even more money. The business Derek had claimed to be running existed only as a shell company he'd created to make the paperwork look legitimate. Every document he'd shown them was fraudulent. Every progress report was fiction. Every promise was a lie designed to keep them from asking questions until it was too late to recover their money. But the betrayals didn't stop there. As my parents sat in my living room that night, crying and expecting sympathy, they revealed information that made my blood boil. They'd known about Derek's gambling problem for 3 years. They'd found casino statements in his mail, discovered he'd been borrowing money from neighbors, learned he'd been pawning family heirlooms to fund his addiction. Instead of confronting him or getting him help, they'd chosen to enable him by paying off smaller debts and making excuses for his behavior. They'd told extended family that Derek was going through a rough patch but would bounce back soon. They'd loaned him money they couldn't afford to lose, always believing his promises that this time would be different. Even worse, they'd hidden Derek's problems from me specifically because they knew I would insist on intervention or consequences. "You would have made such a big deal about it," my mother explained, as if protecting Derek's reputation was more important than protecting the family's financial security. "You never understood that Derek just needed time to figure things out." My father added that they'd thought giving Derek the house money would solve all his problems by allowing him to invest his way out of debt rather than addressing the underlying addiction. They'd gambled their life savings on the hope that enabling Derek one more time would magically cure him of the disease that had been destroying him for years. As they finished explaining their situation, my parents made it clear they expected me to provide a solution. They needed a place to live, money for daily expenses, and help dealing with Derek's creditors who were now pursuing them for additional money Derek had borrowed, using their names as references. They'd already racked up $40,000 in credit card debt on cards Derek had convinced them to open as business expenses for his fake company. The credit card companies were demanding payment, their temporary rental had evicted them for inability to pay rent, and they had nowhere else to go except my house. In their minds, this was my responsibility as the successful daughter who'd always been good with money. Within 24 hours of my parents moving into my guest room, I realized this wasn't going to be the temporary arrangement they'd promised. My mother immediately began rearranging my kitchen cabinets because they weren't organized efficiently, while my father started a list of home improvement projects he thought my house needed. They treated my space like their new permanent residence, spreading their belongings throughout rooms I used for work and relaxation. When I tried to establish boundaries about shared spaces and house rules, they acted like I was being unreasonable for wanting to maintain my own lifestyle in my own home. The kitchen became a war zone every single day. My mother, who'd always cooked elaborate meals as a way of showing love and maintaining control, decided that my eating habits were inadequate and began preparing massive dinners that required hours of cooking and left every pot, pan, and utensil dirty. She'd start cooking at 3 in the afternoon, taking over the entire kitchen until 9 at night, then leave the cleanup for me because she was too tired from all the cooking. When I suggested we take turns cooking or that she might prepare simpler meals, she accused me of being ungrateful for her efforts to bring family warmth back into my life. My father appointed himself as the house's maintenance supervisor, identifying problems that didn't exist and implementing solutions that created actual problems. He decided my bathroom faucet needed replacing and removed it without consulting me, leaving me without water for 2 days while he researched the best replacement options. He rearranged my garage workspace where I kept my architectural models and drafting supplies, claiming he was optimizing the storage efficiency. but actually destroying my organizational system and damaging several expensive scale models I'd built for client presentations. The worst part was their complete lack of respect for my work schedule and professional requirements. I run my architecture practice from a home office that requires quiet concentration for complex design work and client video calls. My parents treated my work time as optional inconvenience, interrupting important calls to ask trivial questions or starting loud projects during my scheduled client meetings. When I explained that my work paid for the house they were living in, they accused me of prioritizing money over family relationships. 3 weeks into this arrangement, my mother called Derek and invited him over for Sunday dinner without mentioning it to me. I came home from a site visit to find Derek sitting at my dining room table, eating my food and acting like nothing had happened. He hugged me like we were still close siblings, thanked me for taking care of Mom and Dad during this difficult time, and launched into a well-rehearsed speech about how the business failure wasn't really his fault. According to Derek, he'd been the victim of unscrupulous business partners who'd stolen the investment money and left him to deal with angry creditors. He painted himself as devastated by the betrayal and desperate to make things right for our parents. The manipulation was masterful in its audacity. Derek claimed he'd been investigating the theft and had identified the real culprits, but needed legal fees to pursue recovery of the stolen funds. He'd already consulted with attorneys who were confident they could recover most of the money within 6 months, but the retainer fees were substantial. Since he'd lost everything in the scam, he needed someone to front the legal costs with the understanding that they'd be repaid with interest once the money was recovered. He had documents, phone numbers for the attorneys, and a timeline for the legal proceedings that sounded legitimate enough to convince our parents he was serious about making things right. When I pointed out that Derek had already proven he couldn't be trusted with money, my parents immediately took his side. They argued that this was different because Derek had learned from his mistakes and was taking responsibility by actively working to fix the situation. They suggested that as the family member with the most financial resources, I had an obligation to help Derek recover their money. My father reminded me that family members support each other during crises, while my mother wondered aloud why I seemed more interested in holding grudges than solving problems. Derek knew exactly which buttons to push with me. He mentioned that he'd heard about my recent client successes and my plans to purchase investment properties, suggesting that someone with my financial acumen would understand the importance of calculated risks. He complimented my business skills and asked for my professional opinion about the legal strategy, making me feel included while simultaneously pressuring me to validate his plan. When I asked specific questions about the supposed theft and the attorneys he'd consulted, he provided detailed answers that seemed researched and plausible. The real shock came when I discovered Derek had been researching my financial situation for months before approaching our parents with his scheme. He knew about my savings account balance, my recent contract bonuses, and my plans to expand my practice into commercial projects. He gained access to this information by helping our parents with their computer problems and using their email account to subscribe to my bank's newsletter, which included balance summaries for customers who'd opted in for financial updates. He'd also been following my social media accounts and my business website to track my professional success and estimate my earning potential. During that dinner, Derek casually mentioned specific details about my finances that he shouldn't have known, including the exact amount I'd saved for investment property down payments. He suggested that loaning him $50,000 for legal fees would be practically risk-free for someone with my savings level and that the return on investment would be better than real estate purchases. When I asked how he knew about my savings, he claimed our parents had mentioned I was doing well financially, but the specificity of his knowledge made it clear he'd been conducting surveillance on my financial situation. My parents watched this entire exchange with hopeful expressions, clearly expecting me to agree to Derek's proposal. They'd already convinced themselves that I would help because they'd seen it as the obvious solution to their problems. When I refused to commit to funding Derek's legal fantasy, they didn't hide their disappointment and frustration. My mother pointed out that I'd never had trouble spending money on my own projects and wondered why I was hesitating to help family. My father suggested that my reluctance showed I didn't really care about getting their money back and preferred to see them suffer the consequences of trusting Derek. The evening ended with Derek promising to send me the legal documents and attorney contact information so I could verify the legitimacy of his plan. He hugged our parents goodbye, told them not to worry because everything would work out soon, and thanked me again for being such a supportive sister, even though I hadn't agreed to anything. After he left, my parents spent the rest of the night explaining why Derek's plan made sense and why my skepticism was unfair given that I hadn't lost hundreds of thousands of dollars like they had. The real campaign began the next morning when my mother started making phone calls to extended family members, carefully crafting a narrative that painted Derek as a victim of business fraud and me as the family member with resources to help recover everyone's losses. She called my cousin Rita, my Aunt Carmen, and my Uncle Roberto, explaining that Derek had found legal representation to recover the stolen money but needed family support to pay attorney fees. In her version of events, Derek was working tirelessly to fix a situation that wasn't his fault, while I was hesitating to help despite having the financial means to easily resolve the crisis. By afternoon, my phone was buzzing with calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months, all of them wanting to discuss the family emergency and my role in solving it. My cousin Rita, who'd always been close to Derek, called to ask why I was making the situation more difficult by refusing to help with legal fees that would benefit everyone. She'd been told that I was holding up the recovery process by demanding unreasonable guarantees and treating Derek like a criminal instead of a family member who needed support. When I tried to explain Derek's actual history and the real circumstances of the money's disappearance, Rita suggested I was being too harsh and that forgiveness was more important than holding on to past mistakes. My Aunt Carmen took a more direct approach, calling to remind me about all the times the family had supported me during my college years and early career struggles. She recounted specific instances when relatives had helped me with loans, job references, and emotional support during difficult periods, suggesting that my current success was built on family assistance that I now had an obligation to repay. According to Carmen, Derek's business failure was exactly the kind of crisis that required family members to come together, and my reluctance to help was disappointing given how much the family had invested in my success. The pressure campaign escalated when my mother announced that my cousin Maria's daughter Elena was having her bridal shower the following weekend, and that several family members had specifically requested to see me there. I should have recognized this as a setup, but I genuinely wanted to celebrate Elena's engagement and hadn't seen that part of the family in over a year. When I arrived at the party, I discovered that my mother had told everyone I'd agreed to help Derek with his legal fees, but was having second thoughts about the amount of the loan. The ambush was coordinated and brutal. After Elena opened her gifts and the formal celebration ended, my Aunt Carmen stood up to address the group, thanking everyone for coming and mentioning how wonderful it was that family members always supported each other during important times. She then transitioned into talking about Derek's legal situation, praising him for taking responsibility and working to recover the family's money, and thanking me publicly for agreeing to help with the attorney fees. The entire room erupted in applause and congratulations, with relatives coming up to hug me and express their gratitude for my generosity. When I tried to explain that I hadn't actually agreed to loan Derek any money, my words were drowned out by family members who were convinced my mother had accurately represented my decision. My Uncle Roberto pulled me aside to discuss the logistics of the loan, asking whether I planned to give Derek the money directly or funnel it through our parents to ensure proper accountability. My cousin Rita wanted to know if I needed help reviewing the legal contracts to make sure the terms protected my investment. Everyone was treating my financial assistance as a done deal, and my attempts to clarify the situation made me look like I was backing out of a commitment I'd never made. My mother sat through this entire scene with a satisfied smile, occasionally nodding when relatives thanked me for my generosity or praised my loyalty to family. When I confronted her afterward about misrepresenting my position, she claimed she'd simply told everyone that I was considering helping Derek and that they'd misunderstood the certainty of my decision. She suggested that the family's positive reaction should show me how much my assistance would mean to everyone and how grateful they were for my willingness to step up during a crisis. The psychological pressure was overwhelming. 35 family members had thanked me for agreeing to help Derek, expressed their admiration for my success and generosity, and shared their relief that the family's financial crisis would soon be resolved. Walking back into that room to announce that I wasn't actually planning to loan Derek any money would have meant disappointing everyone who'd been celebrating my supposed decision. My mother knew exactly what she was doing by creating this public expectation and social pressure to follow through on a commitment I'd never made. The following Monday, Derek appeared at my workplace with both my parents in tow, claiming they had an appointment to finalize the loan paperwork. He walked into my office building wearing a suit, carrying a briefcase, and acting like a serious businessman who was there for a legitimate meeting. My receptionist, who'd met my parents at office holiday parties, assumed this was a scheduled family meeting and buzzed them into my private office, where I was reviewing blueprints with a client. Derek's performance was flawless in its audacity. He introduced himself to my client as my brother, thanked me for agreeing to invest in his real estate recovery project, and began explaining the legal strategy for recovering the stolen funds. He had professional-looking documents, letterhead from law firms, and a presentation that sounded legitimate enough to convince someone who didn't know his history. My client, who was considering hiring me for a large commercial project, listened politely as Derek described his business background and legal situation. The damage to my professional reputation was immediate and lasting. My client, who'd been impressed by my portfolio and references, suddenly had questions about my family situation and whether personal drama might interfere with his project timeline. Derek's unscheduled appearance and emotional family discussion in my office violated every professional boundary I'd worked years to establish. The client left that meeting with serious concerns about my judgment and reliability, ultimately deciding to hire a different architectural firm for his project. When I confronted Derek and my parents about this ambush, they acted like I was overreacting to a simple misunderstanding. Derek claimed he'd thought I wanted to meet at my office to discuss the loan, and he'd brought documentation to make the process more efficient. My parents suggested that my client's reaction showed he wasn't the kind of person I should want to work with anyway, since understanding family obligations was basic human decency. They turned my professional embarrassment into evidence that I needed to prioritize family relationships over business connections with people who didn't share proper values. 2 weeks after the workplace ambush, my parents revealed they'd been much busier than I'd realized in building their case against me. They'd consulted with an attorney who specialized in elder law and had received what they described as very encouraging feedback about their options for compelling family members to provide adequate support for elderly parents. They'd researched state laws regarding adult children's responsibilities and discovered that Washington state had provisions that could potentially require family members to contribute to elderly parents' care if those parents were unable to support themselves. The attorney, whose name was Jonathan Hartwell and whose office was in downtown Seattle, had apparently been fascinated by their case and offered to work with them on a contingency basis if they decided to pursue legal action. According to my parents, Hartwell had explained that elder abuse wasn't just physical neglect, but also included financial neglect when adult children had the means to help but refused to provide reasonable assistance. Since I had substantial savings and a successful business, while they were facing homelessness and poverty, a case could potentially be made that my refusal to help constituted a form of elder abuse. My father had been busy documenting what he called evidence of inadequate living conditions in my guest room, taking photos that made the space look cramped and uncomfortable. He'd photographed the simple furnishings, the shared bathroom situation, and the lack of a private sitting area, creating a visual narrative that suggested I was housing them in substandard conditions while living luxuriously in the rest of my house. He'd also documented my work travel schedule, noting dates when I was away overnight for client meetings or site visits, framing these business trips as evidence that I was abandoning elderly parents who needed daily care and supervision. My mother had been equally busy building a case based on emotional neglect and family dysfunction. She'd written a detailed journal describing my supposed coldness toward Derek, my resistance to family gatherings, and my prioritization of career success over family relationships. In her narrative, I was a daughter who'd used family support to achieve success, but then rejected family members when they needed help in return. She'd documented specific conversations where I'd expressed frustration with Derek's behavior, presenting my legitimate concerns about his addiction and irresponsibility as evidence of sibling rivalry and jealousy. The manipulation reached a new level when my childhood friend Kelly, who worked as a social worker for the county, called to give me an unofficial warning about a complaint that had been filed against me. Kelly explained that she wasn't supposed to discuss ongoing investigations, but she was concerned enough about the allegations to risk her professional standing by alerting me to the situation. According to the complaint, an elderly couple had reported that their adult daughter was forcing them to live in inadequate conditions while refusing to provide financial assistance despite having substantial means to help them. Kelly had been assigned to investigate the elder abuse allegations and had already conducted preliminary interviews with my parents, who'd presented themselves as victims of family neglect. They'd shown her photos of their living situation, provided documentation of their financial crisis, and explained that their daughter had plenty of money, but was unwilling to help them recover funds that had been stolen from them. They'd painted a picture of an ungrateful child who'd abandoned her responsibilities to elderly parents in need. The most disturbing part of Kelly's warning was that my parents had come to the social services office with a prepared presentation that included detailed plans for how they intended to prove my unfitness as a caregiver. They'd researched elder abuse statutes, gathered documentation about their financial situation, and even brought character references from family members who could testify about their past generosity and my current selfishness. This wasn't a spontaneous complaint born from desperation, but a calculated legal strategy designed to force me into compliance with their financial demands. Derek had been coaching them through this entire process, providing research about legal precedents and helping them craft their narrative to maximize sympathy and legal standing. He'd found examples of cases where adult children had been successfully sued for elder neglect, and he'd helped my parents understand how to present their situation to fit those legal frameworks. His gambling addiction and financial fraud weren't mentioned in their complaint, which instead focused entirely on my alleged failures as a daughter and caregiver. The social pressure campaign expanded beyond extended family to my immediate neighborhood and professional community. My parents began telling neighbors that I was a cruel daughter who wouldn't help family members recover money that had been stolen from them. They described Derek as a victim of business fraud who was working with attorneys to recover the stolen funds, while portraying me as the successful daughter who could easily solve the problem but chose to watch her parents suffer instead. Mrs. Henderson, my next-door neighbor who'd always been friendly, stopped speaking to me after my mother explained the family situation during a chance encounter at the mailbox. According to my mother's version, Derek had been the victim of sophisticated criminals who'd stolen the family's life savings, and I was refusing to help with legal fees that would allow the family to recover their money and restore their financial security. Mrs. Henderson, who was elderly herself and sympathetic to seniors facing financial difficulties, was horrified by what she perceived as my callousness toward my parents' crisis. The professional sabotage became more systematic when Derek contacted my biggest client, a developer named Marcus Thompson who was considering hiring me for a mixed-use commercial project worth $85,000 in fees. Derek had researched my client list through my business website and social media accounts, identifying Thompson as my most significant potential source of revenue. He called Thompson's office, introduced himself as my brother, and suggested that family crisis might be affecting my ability to focus on client projects. Derek's approach was subtle but devastating. He didn't directly criticize my professional abilities, but instead expressed concern about my emotional state during a difficult family period. He mentioned that our parents were going through financial difficulties and that the stress was affecting the whole family, including my ability to concentrate on work projects. He suggested that Thompson might want to consider whether family drama might interfere with project timelines and deliverables, framing his sabotage as brotherly concern for my well-being. Thompson, who'd been enthusiastic about hiring me based on my portfolio and references, began asking pointed questions about my availability and commitment level. He wanted to know whether personal issues might affect my ability to meet deadlines or maintain professional standards during the project. When I tried to address his concerns without revealing the full scope of my family's manipulation, my explanations sounded defensive and unprofessional. Thompson ultimately decided to postpone the project indefinitely, citing concerns about timing and resource allocation that clearly stemmed from Derek's interference. The coordinated nature of these attacks became clear when I realized that my parents and Derek had been meeting regularly to plan their strategy and coordinate their efforts. They divided responsibilities based on their individual strengths and access to different parts of my life. My mother handled extended family relationships and neighborhood connections. My father focused on documenting evidence for potential legal action, and Derek targeted my professional relationships and business opportunities. They were working together as a team with a shared goal of pressuring me into financial compliance through systematic destruction of my personal and professional reputation. The morning I discovered my parents attempting to access my bank accounts was the moment I realized this situation had escalated beyond family dysfunction into actual criminal territory. I'd gone to my local branch to deposit a client check and withdraw cash for a weekend trip, only to be informed by the teller that there had been suspicious activity on my account. Someone had attempted to add an authorized user named Derek Martinez using forged signatures and fake identification documents. The bank's fraud prevention system had flagged the attempt because the signatures didn't match their samples, but the incident had triggered a temporary freeze on all my accounts pending investigation. The bank manager, Linda Chin, showed me copies of the documents that had been submitted with the authorization request. The signatures were clearly forged attempts to mimic my handwriting, and the supporting identification included photocopied documents that had been altered to show Derek as a business partner with legitimate access to my accounts. The person who'd submitted these documents had claimed there was a family emergency requiring immediate access to funds for legal fees, and that I'd authorized the addition but was traveling and unavailable to complete the paperwork in person. What made this attempted fraud even more disturbing was the level of personal information required to make the request seem legitimate. The forged documents included my social security number, my mother's maiden name, and details about my account history that could only have been obtained by someone with access to my personal files and financial records. Derek had clearly been planning this theft for weeks or months, gathering information during his visits to my house and using my parents' legitimate access to my emergency contact information to build a convincing fraud package. Linda explained that the bank would need to keep my accounts frozen for at least 72 hours while they investigated the attempted fraud and verified that I hadn't actually authorized the account changes. During this period, I wouldn't be able to access my own money for basic expenses, let alone the business costs associated with running my architectural practice. The timing couldn't have been worse, as I had payroll obligations to my contract drafters and a major client payment due within the week. While I was dealing with the banking crisis, my brother Carlos called from Phoenix, and his tone immediately told me that my parents' manipulation campaign had reached the rest of the family. Carlos, who lived across the country and only spoke to our parents a few times a year, had been told a completely fabricated version of recent events that painted me as the villain in our family's financial drama. According to the story my parents had told him, I had kicked them out of their home after Derek's business failed, refused to let them stay with me permanently, and was now threatening to have them arrested for trying to access family money to pay for basic living expenses. Carlos was furious in a way I'd never heard before. He accused me of abandoning our parents during their greatest time of need and prioritizing my own comfort over family loyalty. He'd been told that Derek was working with attorneys to recover the stolen investment money, but that I was blocking the legal process by refusing to provide necessary funds for attorney fees and court costs. In Carlos's understanding, I was the successful daughter with plenty of money who was watching our parents suffer rather than temporarily helping with expenses that would ultimately benefit the entire family. When I tried to explain the real situation, including Derek's gambling addiction, the forged bank documents, and the systematic manipulation campaign, Carlos dismissed my account as exaggerated drama designed to justify my selfishness. He pointed out that our parents had always been generous with all their children and that they deserved better treatment during their financial crisis. He threatened to cut contact with me permanently if I didn't start acting like a responsible daughter and help resolve the family's problems instead of creating additional drama. The conversation with Carlos was devastating because it showed me how effectively my parents and Derek had poisoned family relationships with their lies and manipulations. Carlos had always been the peacemaker in our family, the brother who stayed neutral during conflicts and encouraged everyone to work together. The fact that they'd turned him against me so completely meant that other family members were probably receiving similar misinformation about my character and behavior. My professional situation continued deteriorating as word spread through my business community about my family problems and their potential impact on client relationships. 2 smaller clients called to express concerns about project timelines, having heard rumors that personal issues might affect my availability and focus. My reputation for professionalism and reliability, which had taken years to build, was being systematically destroyed by Derek's interference and my parents' public complaints about my treatment of elderly family members. The stress of managing multiple crises simultaneously was affecting my health and mental clarity in ways that made it harder to respond effectively to each new attack. I wasn't sleeping well because of tension in my own home. I couldn't access my bank accounts to manage basic business operations, and I was fielding constant phone calls from family members who'd been fed distorted information about my behavior. My work quality was suffering because I couldn't concentrate on design projects while dealing with family emergencies every single day. The breaking point came when I returned home from a client meeting to find my parents going through my bedroom with cameras, photographing my personal belongings and private documents. They claimed they were documenting assets for their attorney, who had apparently advised them to create an inventory of my possessions to support their case for financial neglect. They'd been through my jewelry box, my financial files, my personal correspondence, and even my clothing, taking photos of everything valuable or significant. My father had a legal pad where he'd been recording descriptions and estimated values of my belongings, including family heirlooms that had been given to me by my grandmother before she died. He'd photographed my computer equipment, my professional drafting tools, my furniture, and my art collection, creating what looked like a pre-lawsuit asset inventory. When I demanded to know what they thought they were doing, he explained that their attorney had told them to document my lifestyle and possessions to demonstrate that I had substantial means to help them, but was choosing to live luxuriously while they suffered. My mother had focused on my personal documents, photographing bank statements, client contracts, and business correspondence that should have been private and confidential. She'd gone through my filing system, my desk drawers, and even my laptop bag, creating a comprehensive record of my financial situation and business relationships. When I pointed out that accessing my business documents without permission might violate client confidentiality agreements and professional ethics rules, she suggested that I should have thought about professional consequences before abandoning my responsibilities to family. The discovery that they'd been conducting surveillance in my own bedroom while I was away at work was the final violation of trust and privacy that made continuing this living arrangement impossible. They weren't guests in my home who were temporarily down on their luck. They were adversaries who were actively working to damage my life and steal my assets. The photography session in my bedroom was preparation for legal action designed to force me to surrender my savings and possibly part ownership of my house to fund Derek's continued gambling and substance abuse. As I stood in my violated bedroom, looking at my parents holding cameras and legal pads full of notes about my possessions, I realized that I was no longer dealing with family members who needed help during a crisis. I was dealing with people who had been turned into weapons by Derek's manipulation and their own unwillingness to accept responsibility for their choices. They weren't going to leave voluntarily, they weren't going to stop pressuring me for money, and they weren't going to respect any boundaries I tried to establish as long as they believed I could be intimidated into compliance. The next morning, while I was sitting on my front porch trying to figure out how to regain control of my life, my neighbor Catherine Walsh approached me with a concerned expression and a manila folder full of documents. Catherine was a retired family court judge who'd lived next door for 15 years, and I'd always respected her wisdom and directness. She'd apparently been watching the situation unfold at my house and had become increasingly disturbed by what she'd observed and overheard during my parents' campaign against me. Catherine had been documenting my parents' lies to neighborhood residents, keeping a detailed log of their complaints about my character and their requests for community support in pressuring me to help Derek financially. She'd recorded dates, times, and specific quotes from conversations where my parents had misrepresented facts about our family situation and my role in their financial crisis. Most importantly, she'd witnessed my parents attempting to recruit neighbors as potential witnesses for their planned legal action against me. The folder Catherine showed me contained her notes from multiple conversations where my parents had tried to convince neighbors that I was guilty of elder abuse and neglect. They'd asked neighbors to write letters supporting their allegations, requested testimony about my supposedly selfish behavior, and even suggested that community members should contact social services to report their concerns about my treatment of elderly parents. Catherine had refused these requests and had been quietly gathering evidence of their manipulation campaign instead. Catherine's legal background made her uniquely qualified to recognize the tactics my parents and Derek were using, which she identified as classic patterns of financial exploitation and emotional abuse disguised as family loyalty. She explained that adult children are often targeted by family members who use guilt, manipulation, and legal threats to gain access to assets they haven't earned. The elder abuse allegations were a common strategy used by financially irresponsible parents to force successful children into funding their poor decisions and enabling continued destructive behavior. More importantly, Catherine had professional connections that could help me fight back against my family's legal and social attacks. She introduced me to Rachel Chin, an attorney who specialized in defending against false elder abuse claims and financial exploitation by family members. Rachel had handled dozens of cases where adult children were sued or threatened by parents who expected their successful children to fund gambling addictions, failed businesses, and irresponsible lifestyle choices. Rachel's office was located in downtown Portland, and her practice focused specifically on protecting successful professionals from family members who used the legal system as a weapon to force financial compliance. She'd successfully defended doctors, attorneys, business owners, and other high-earning individuals whose parents, siblings, or adult children had filed false abuse claims as leverage in financial disputes. Her success rate was impressive because she understood both the legal strategies used by exploitation attorneys and the emotional manipulation tactics used by family members who refused to accept personal responsibility. During our initial consultation, Rachel reviewed the evidence I'd gathered about Derek's gambling addiction, my parents' knowing participation in his fraud schemes, and their current campaign to force me into funding his continued irresponsible behavior. She was particularly interested in the documentation Catherine had provided about my parents' neighborhood manipulation campaign and their attempts to recruit witnesses for false abuse allegations. This evidence proved that their legal threats were part of a coordinated strategy rather than legitimate concerns about elder care. Rachel explained that my parents' attorney, Jonathan Hartwell, was known in the legal community as someone who took questionable elder abuse cases on contingency fees, hoping to pressure defendants into settlements rather than fighting charges in court. Hartwell's strategy relied on the emotional and professional damage caused by abuse allegations, even when those allegations were ultimately proven false. Most of his clients preferred to pay settlements rather than endure the public scrutiny and legal costs associated with defending against elder abuse charges. The key to defeating Hartwell's strategy was proving that my parents' allegations were motivated by financial greed rather than legitimate welfare concerns, and that Derek was the primary beneficiary of any money they obtained from me. Rachel had investigated Derek's financial history and discovered that he owed substantial money to multiple creditors, including some connected to illegal gambling operations that used violence to collect debts. My parents weren't just enabling Derek's addiction, they were potentially putting themselves and me in physical danger by owing money to dangerous people. Rachel's investigation revealed that Derek had been planning this scheme for over a year, researching my financial situation and coaching my parents on legal strategies for compelling family financial support. He'd consulted with multiple attorneys about elder abuse statutes, studied successful cases where adult children had been forced to pay family members, and developed a comprehensive plan for using my parents as proxies in extracting money from my savings. The elder abuse allegations weren't desperate attempts by confused elderly people, but calculated legal strategy designed by Derek to steal my assets. Kelly, my social worker friend, had conducted her own investigation into my parents' complaint and was prepared to testify that their allegations appeared to be financially motivated rather than based on legitimate welfare concerns. Kelly had interviewed my parents multiple times and had become suspicious of their rehearsed responses to questions about their living situation and financial needs. She'd also attempted to contact Derek to get his perspective on the family situation, but he'd refused to speak with social services investigators, which was unusual for someone genuinely concerned about elderly parents' welfare. Kelly's professional assessment was that my parents were being manipulated by Derek into filing false allegations, but that they were also willing participants in the scheme because they hoped to benefit financially from any settlement or court judgment. She'd seen similar cases where elderly parents were coached by adult children into making abuse allegations against siblings who'd achieved financial success. The pattern was always the same. Family members with addiction or financial problems would identify successful relatives as targets and use elderly parents as weapons to extract money through legal intimidation. The most important piece of evidence Kelly provided was documentation that Derek had been researching elder abuse statutes and legal precedents for months before my parents filed their complaint. He'd accessed legal databases from public libraries, printed articles about successful elder abuse cases, and even attended legal aid seminars about protecting elderly people from family neglect. This evidence proved that Derek had planned the legal strategy and coached my parents on how to present their allegations for maximum impact. Catherine also revealed that Derek had approached her directly, asking if she'd noticed signs of my neglect toward my parents and whether she'd be willing to write a statement supporting their concerns about my behavior. Catherine had pretended to consider his request while actually documenting his attempts to recruit false witnesses. Derek had provided her with specific talking points about incidents she should mention and language she should use to make her statement more compelling to social services investigators. With Rachel's help, I began building a countercase that would expose my family's fraud and protect me from their continued attempts at legal and financial manipulation. The strategy involved documenting Derek's history of addiction and financial irresponsibility, proving my parents' willing participation in enabling his destructive behavior, and demonstrating that their current legal threats were motivated by greed rather than legitimate welfare concerns. We also plan to file criminal charges for the attempted bank fraud and explore civil remedies for defamation and harassment. Armed with evidence and legal representation, I began fighting back against my family's systematic attacks on my life and reputation. Rachel filed for a restraining order against Derek based on his workplace harassment, attempted bank fraud, and threats to my professional relationships. The legal documents we submitted included transcripts of his threatening phone calls, copies of the forged bank authorization documents, and testimony from witnesses who'd observed his manipulative and aggressive behavior during visits to my office and home. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week, giving Derek and his attorney time to respond to our allegations and present their defense. Rachel was confident that we had overwhelming evidence of Derek's harassment and criminal behavior, but she warned me that his attorney would likely try to present him as a concerned brother who was trying to help elderly parents during a legitimate family crisis. Derek's defense strategy would focus on portraying my legal action as evidence of my callousness toward family members who needed help. While we waited for the court hearing, I implemented Rachel's advice about protecting myself from continued financial and professional attacks. I changed my banking passwords, set up additional security measures for my business accounts, and installed a comprehensive home security system that would document any attempts by my parents or Derek to access my property without permission. I also contacted my professional liability insurance company to alert them about potential defamation claims related to my family's interference with client relationships. The private investigator Rachel had hired discovered that Derek's gambling debts were much larger than anyone had realized, and that he'd been using multiple fake identities to access credit and borrow money from dangerous sources. The investigation revealed outstanding debts to several underground gambling operations that used intimidation and violence to collect money from delinquent borrowers. Derek hadn't just stolen my parents' house money to pay gambling debts. He continued accumulating new debts while promising to pay back the old ones. This information explained Derek's desperation to access my savings and his willingness to destroy family relationships to get money. He wasn't just trying to fund continued gambling, he was trying to avoid physical harm from creditors who'd grown tired of his excuses and empty promises. My parents had become unwitting accomplices in Derek's attempts to escape violent consequences for his addiction, but they were also putting themselves and me at risk by owing money to people who didn't care about family dynamics or legal technicalities. The investigator also discovered that Derek had been researching my daily routine, my work schedule, and my social activities through social media surveillance and neighborhood observation. He'd created detailed profiles of my client relationships, my professional contacts, and my personal friendships, identifying potential targets for his manipulation and sabotage campaigns. This evidence proved that his interference with my business wasn't spontaneous family drama, but calculated strategy designed to damage my earning capacity and force me into financial desperation. Rachel used this evidence to file criminal charges against Derek for identity theft, attempted fraud, harassment, and stalking. The charges were serious enough to potentially result in jail time, especially given Derek's history of financial crimes and his current violation of probation terms from a previous gambling-related conviction. The criminal charges would also strengthen our position in the restraining order hearing and provide additional leverage in defending against my parents' elder abuse allegations. The counteroffensive against my parents' defamation campaign involved providing evidence to extended family members showing the real timeline of events and Derek's manipulation tactics. Rachel prepared a comprehensive packet of documents including Derek's criminal history, evidence of his gambling addiction, proof of my parents' knowing participation in his fraud schemes, and documentation of their coordinated campaign to extract money from my savings through legal intimidation. I sent this information packet to Carlos, along with a detailed letter explaining how my parents and Derek had manipulated him into believing false information about my behavior and character. Carlos was shocked to learn about Derek's extensive criminal history and the sophisticated nature of the fraud scheme that had cost our parents their home and life savings. He immediately called to apologize for his harsh words and offered to help expose Derek's lies to other family members who'd been fed similar misinformation. The professional rehabilitation campaign involved reaching out to clients and business contacts who'd been affected by Derek's interference, providing them with factual information about the situation and assurances that my family crisis was being resolved through legal channels. Marcus Thompson, the client who'd postponed his project after Derek's visit, agreed to meet with me and Rachel to discuss the situation. After learning the full scope of Derek's manipulation and seeing evidence of his criminal behavior, Thompson reinstated our contract and even increased the project scope as a gesture of support. Word spread through Portland's architectural community about my family's attacks on my business, generating sympathy and support from colleagues who'd experienced similar situations with financially irresponsible relatives. Several prominent architects offered to provide character references for court proceedings, and the local professional association issued a statement condemning family interference with members' business relationships. The professional support helped restore my reputation and demonstrated that Derek's sabotage had backfired by exposing his tactics to people who understood professional ethics. Catherine organized a neighborhood meeting where she presented evidence of my parents' manipulation campaign and their attempts to recruit false witnesses for their legal case. The meeting was attended by 12 neighbors who'd been approached by my parents with requests for statements supporting their elder abuse allegations. Catherine's documentation of my parents' lies and contradictory statements convinced several neighbors to provide sworn statements contradicting my parents' claims about my behavior and character. The most satisfying victory came when Jonathan Hartwell, my parents' attorney, withdrew from their case after reviewing the evidence Rachel had gathered about Derek's criminal history and my parents' willing participation in his fraud schemes. Hartwell realized that proceeding with elder abuse allegations would expose his clients to criminal charges for filing false reports and potentially subject him to professional discipline for knowingly pursuing frivolous litigation. Without legal representation, my parents' threats of lawsuits and criminal charges lost their credibility and power to intimidate me. Kelly officially closed the elder abuse investigation after interviewing the neighbors Catherine had organized and reviewing evidence of Derek's manipulation campaign. Her final report stated that the original complaint appeared to have been motivated by financial considerations rather than legitimate welfare concerns, and that the alleged victim was actually being exploited by family members who were using legal system to facilitate financial fraud. Kelly's professional assessment validated everything I'd been saying about my family's real motivations and tactics. The bank completed its fraud investigation and determined that Derek had attempted to gain unauthorized access to my accounts using forged documents and false identification. They restored full access to my accounts, implemented additional security measures to prevent future fraud attempts, and provided documentation that would support criminal charges against Derek. The bank's investigation also revealed that Derek had made similar fraud attempts against other family members and business associates, establishing a pattern of financial crimes that strengthened the case against him. The restraining order hearing took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in downtown Portland, with Derek appearing in court accompanied by a public defender who'd clearly been assigned to his case at the last minute. Derek had been unable to afford private legal representation after his previous attorney withdrew upon learning about his extensive criminal history and outstanding warrants related to gambling debts. He looked disheveled and desperate, a sharp contrast to the confident manipulator who'd been terrorizing my family for months. Rachel presented our evidence methodically and comprehensively, starting with Derek's history of gambling addiction and financial fraud, then moving to his recent attempts to access my bank accounts using forged documents. She provided the court with transcripts of his threatening phone calls, copies of the fake authorization forms he'd submitted to my bank, and testimony from witnesses who'd observed his harassment at my workplace. The judge was clearly disturbed by the scope and sophistication of Derek's criminal behavior. Derek's public defender attempted to portray him as a desperate son trying to help elderly parents recover money that had been stolen from them, but his argument collapsed under the weight of evidence showing Derek's systematic deception and manipulation. The defense couldn't explain why Derek had forged my signatures to access my bank accounts if his only goal was helping our parents with legitimate legal fees. They couldn't justify his workplace harassment or his attempts to sabotage my professional relationships if he was genuinely concerned about family welfare. The judge granted the restraining order with unusually broad terms that prohibited Derek from contacting me directly or indirectly, approaching my home or workplace, interfering with my business relationships, or using any intermediaries to communicate with me. The order also required Derek to stay at least 500 feet away from my property and prohibited him from accessing any financial accounts or documents with my name on them. Violation of any terms would result in immediate arrest and criminal prosecution. As we left the courthouse, Derek's desperation became apparent when he violated the fresh restraining order by following me to the parking garage and attempting to convince me to drop the criminal charges against him. He claimed that dangerous people were threatening to hurt him and our parents if he didn't pay his gambling debts within the next few weeks. He begged me to loan him $50,000, promising to disappear from our lives forever if I'd just help him escape the consequences of his addiction one final time. I called the police on my cell phone while Derek continued his desperate plea, and he was arrested within minutes for violating the restraining order that had been issued less than an hour earlier. As the officers handcuffed him, Derek screamed that I was responsible for whatever happened to our parents when his creditors came looking for money. His threats were recorded by courthouse security cameras and would later be used as additional evidence in his criminal trial for harassment and attempted extortion. That afternoon, Derek's creditors finally located my parents at my house and served them with legal papers demanding payment for debts Derek had accumulated using their names as references and co-signers. The papers revealed that Derek had forged their signatures on loan documents and credit applications, accumulating over $60,000 in additional debt beyond the money he'd already stolen from the house sale. My parents were legally liable for these debts despite having no knowledge of their existence. The confrontation with Derek's creditors was the moment my parents finally understood the full scope of their golden child's betrayal and manipulation. These weren't sophisticated business partners who'd stolen Derek's investment money. They were loan sharks and underground gambling operators who'd been funding Derek's addiction for years. Derek hadn't been the victim of business fraud. He'd been a willing participant in an escalating cycle of borrowing and gambling that had spiraled completely out of control. For the first time since this crisis began, my parents were forced to confront the reality that Derek had never intended to help them or repay their money. The business plan, the legal strategy, the promises of recovered funds, the attorney meetings, everything had been elaborate fiction designed to buy time while Derek figured out how to access my savings. He'd manipulated them into destroying their relationship with me, their only financially stable child, while he planned to steal from me and then disappear without paying back any of the money he'd taken. My mother broke down completely when she realized that Derek had been planning this scheme since before they'd sold their house, researching my financial situation and developing strategies for accessing my money while pretending to be a reformed family member who'd learned from his mistakes. The son she'd defended and enabled for decades had viewed her and my father as tools to be used in stealing from his sister. Every tearful apology, every promise to do better, every emotional manipulation had been calculated performance designed to maintain access to family resources. My father's reaction was pure rage when he discovered that Derek had been gambling with their house money while sending them fake progress reports about successful real estate investments. Derek had been sitting in casinos, spending their life savings on poker games and slot machines, while they'd been planning their retirement and bragging to friends about their son's business success. The elaborate deception had continued for months, while Derek lost hundreds of thousands of dollars and accumulated dangerous debts that now threatened everyone's safety. The financial devastation was complete and irreversible. Derek had stolen $740,000 from the house sale, accumulated an additional $60,000 in debt using my parents' names, and left them facing bankruptcy while owing money to violent criminals who didn't care about their age or circumstances. My parents had no assets left to seize, no income beyond Social Security, and no way to pay the debts Derek had created in their names. But the emotional devastation was even worse than the financial destruction. My parents had to confront the reality that they'd spent decades enabling an addiction that had turned their son into a predator who viewed his own family as targets for theft and manipulation. They'd sacrificed their daughter's love and respect to protect a son who'd been planning to destroy their entire family for his own financial benefit. Every dollar they'd given Derek over the years had funded his gambling habit and taught him that manipulation and lies were more effective than honesty and responsibility. My parents finally understood that Derek would never change, never recover, and never repay the money he'd stolen because he'd never viewed it as borrowed money that needed to be returned. In Derek's mind, family resources existed for his personal use, and family relationships were tools for accessing money and avoiding consequences. He'd destroy anyone's life, including his parents' retirement and security, to fund his addiction and escape responsibility for his choices. As my parents sat in my living room, surrounded by legal papers and facing criminal threats from Derek's creditors, they finally asked me what I needed from them to rebuild our relationship. They were ready to accept responsibility for their role in enabling Derek's behavior, ready to testify against him in criminal proceedings, and ready to commit to therapy and family counseling that would help them understand how their choices had nearly destroyed our entire family. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee on a peaceful Saturday morning, looking out at my garden where my parents had planted tomatoes and herbs in raised beds they'd built with their own hands. The transformation in our family dynamics had been remarkable, though the journey to healing had required hard work, therapy, and painful honesty from everyone involved. Derek was serving 18 months in county jail for fraud, identity theft, and violation of his probation terms, finally facing real consequences for his actions without family members rushing to bail him out or make excuses for his behavior. My parents had moved into Sunset Manor, a comfortable senior living community about 20 minutes from my house, where they'd made friends and developed independence while staying close enough for regular family visits. They were living on their Social Security income and a small pension my father had forgotten about from his early career, managing their finances carefully and attending Gamblers Anonymous family meetings to understand how they'd enabled Derek's addiction for so many years. The simplicity of their new lifestyle had brought them a peace they'd never experienced while constantly worrying about Derek's latest crisis. The therapy process had been difficult but transformative for our family relationships. Dr. Sarah Williams, the family therapist we'd been working with, had helped my parents understand how their fear of setting boundaries with Derek had turned them into accomplices in his financial crimes. They'd learned that love doesn't mean protecting people from the consequences of their choices, and that enabling destructive behavior isn't kindness, but cruelty disguised as family loyalty. They'd also had to confront their own addiction to being needed by Derek, recognizing that his constant crises had given them a sense of purpose that had become unhealthy and destructive. For me, therapy had revealed patterns in my own behavior that had made me vulnerable to family manipulation. I'd learned that my need to be the responsible, successful daughter had made me feel obligated to solve everyone's problems, even when those problems were created by people who refused to take responsibility for their own choices. Dr. Williams helped me understand that protecting myself from exploitation wasn't selfish, but necessary for maintaining healthy relationships with people who actually respected my boundaries and valued my well-being. My professional life had not only recovered, but had grown stronger than ever before. The support I'd received from colleagues and clients during my family crisis had led to new business relationships and opportunities. Marcus Thompson had become one of my most enthusiastic advocates, referring 3 major clients to my practice and praising my handling of personal challenges under pressure. The architectural community's response to Derek's interference had demonstrated that professional integrity and ethical behavior were valued and protected in my industry. I'd also become an advocate for other professionals dealing with family financial exploitation, speaking at conferences about protecting your assets and business from relatives who use guilt and manipulation as weapons. My story had resonated with audiences because family exploitation was much more common than most people realized, particularly among successful professionals whose achievements made them targets for financially irresponsible relatives. The presentations had led to consulting opportunities helping other victims develop strategies for protecting themselves while maintaining healthy family relationships where possible. On a personal level, I'd begun dating Marcus Rivera, a therapist who specialized in addiction and family dynamics. Marcus understood the challenges of setting boundaries with destructive family members because he'd worked with hundreds of families dealing with similar issues. Our relationship was built on mutual respect, honest communication, and shared values about responsibility and accountability. For the first time in my life, I was with someone who celebrated my success rather than viewing it as an obligation to solve other people's problems. Carlos had flown in from Phoenix for our monthly family dinner, a tradition we'd established to maintain healthy connections while honoring everyone's boundaries and independence. These gatherings were completely different from the manipulative family meetings of the past because everyone was expected to contribute positively and treat each other with respect. We talked about our work, our hobbies, and our plans for the future without anyone demanding money or expecting others to solve their self-created problems. The legal resolution had been satisfying in its completeness. Derek had pled guilty to multiple felony charges to avoid a trial that would have exposed the full extent of his crimes and resulted in a longer prison sentence. He'd been ordered to pay restitution that he'd never be able to afford, and his criminal record would make employment difficult when he was released. More importantly, the conviction had sent a clear message that family relationships didn't provide immunity from consequences for criminal behavior. My parents had testified against Derek during his sentencing hearing, describing how his manipulation had nearly destroyed their family and expressing their commitment to breaking the cycle of enabling that had allowed his addiction to flourish. Their testimony had been emotionally difficult, but necessary for their own healing and for establishing clear boundaries about acceptable behavior in our family. They'd finally chosen protecting their relationship with me over protecting Derek from the consequences of his choices. The financial recovery had been limited but meaningful. We'd been able to recover about $15,000 through Derek's restitution payments and the sale of some items he'd purchased with stolen money. My parents used this money as a down payment on their apartment at Sunset Manor, where they'd built a comfortable life surrounded by friends who didn't know about their past financial mistakes. They'd learned to live within their means and find joy in simple pleasures rather than constantly worrying about money and Derek's problems. The most important change was the quality of our family relationships, which were now based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation and manipulation. My parents had learned to appreciate the daughter who'd worked hard and achieved success rather than viewing my accomplishments as resources to be exploited for Derek's benefit. I'd learned to value family members who supported my growth rather than trying to fix people who didn't want to change. Looking back on the crisis that had nearly destroyed our family, I realized that Derek's attacks had ultimately made us stronger by forcing us to confront unhealthy patterns and establish better boundaries. The pain of almost losing each other had motivated everyone to do the hard work of therapy and personal growth that had transformed our relationships. We learned that real family isn't about blood obligation or unconditional enablement, but about people who love each other enough to demand the best from each other. The final lesson from our experience was that saving people from the consequences of their choices doesn't help them grow or recover. It just enables continued destructive behavior while exhausting everyone who cares about them. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone's self-destruction, even when they're family members who try to make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. True recovery requires accountability, and accountability requires consequences that enable people won't provide. As I finished my coffee and prepared to drive to Sunset Manor for our family dinner, I felt grateful for the life I'd built and the relationships I'd fought to protect. My parents would be waiting with stories about their week and questions about my latest projects, treating me like the successful, independent woman I'd worked to become rather than the family bank account they'd once viewed me as. We'd found our way back to loving each other without the toxic dynamics that had nearly destroyed us all. Have you ever dealt with family members who expected you to fund their poor financial decisions? How did you handle the pressure and guilt when relatives demanded money for problems they'd created themselves? Share your experiences in the comments below and let me know how you protected yourself while maintaining family relationships. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel for more real-life family drama stories, and share this with anyone who might be dealing with similar manipulation from relatives who view success as an obligation to solve their problems. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes saving yourself is the first step towards saving your family. You deserve relationships built on love and respect, not guilt and financial exploitation.